Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Feroz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. Today, I have a very special guest who usually sits on the other side of the table interviewing others. Adrian Harewood, who's, I think, very well known in Canada. Adrian is co-host of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC News Ottawa. He attended elementary and high school at Ashbury College and was involved in community radio at Carleton University and University of Ottawa. He's been a guest host on national CBC programs such as It Happens, Sounds Like Canada, and The Current. Before coming to television, Harewood was the host of All in a Day on CBC Radio One in Ottawa. It's a real privilege to welcome Adrian Harewood to Organizing in the Time of COVID. Welcome. So nice to see you again.
It's great to see you, Feroz. Thanks so much for having me.
That's great. Adrian, you're a journalist. You've been, hosting major shows and you've been watching what's been happening in Canada and internationally with the rise of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. I would just wonder, what has COVID revealed for you?
What has it revealed to me? Well, I think it's first of all revealed some of the kind of structural, the kind of inequalities that exist within the society. It's kind of exposed them for all to see. Obviously, COVID-19 has been devastating for hundreds of thousands, for millions of people around the world. We know the economic devastation that has been caused as a result of it. So, of course, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, of course, the kind of impact, the deaths that have occurred, of course. Here in Canada, for example, the majority of COVID-19 related deaths have happened in long-term care homes. Now, these are the homes where seniors, the older folks, live. And, every society must be judged by the way in which the most vulnerable among us are treated. Most societies take pride in the way in which they look after and care for both their young folk and their older folk. And so I think a lot of Canadians have been quite horrified to see the number of seniors, folks in these long-term care, these nursing homes, who have succumbed to the coronavirus. It's been quite horrific. In some instances, in some of these nursing homes, dozens and dozens of people have died. And what also has been demonstrated is how often these seniors in these homes are neglected. That's been quite horrifying. The kind of the lack of cleanliness, the lack of regard for the basic dignity of a lot of these older folks. They're finding that many of these folks are often, left to lie in their own excrement, for weeks and weeks on end. And I think many Canadians have been surprised. They've been mortified at how, the system that perhaps many were led to believe was taking care of the elderly has failed. And that's really our collective failure, as a society. So that's one thing that I think has been exposed. In terms of, for example, on the education side, in order for, most young people now, because schools across the country are closed, most young people have had to be homeschooled in the last 3 months. Now, the only way in which really you can stay connected with your teacher is if you have access to the internet, if you have a computer that works. And if you are lacking, if for whatever reason you don't have access to that connection, then you lose out. And so invariably, it's those young people who come from, economically disadvantaged, poor communities who have been suffering throughout this period, because of course they cannot be connected to their teachers and engage in the online classes, which would enable them to continue with their education. So again, the COVID-19 has exposed the class divide, the disparities that exist within the society. I can also say that those people who put themselves most at risk are also the ones who can least afford not to work. The fact is that the vast majority of people who are able to stay at home are those people who are, one would describe as being part of the middle class or the upper middle class. They have jobs that allow them to use computers so that they can remain at home. But those people who are, for example, the store clerks, or they are the health workers, janitors, whatever the case might be, the cleaners, the personal support workers, and invariably those people are racialized as well in this society. So Black and brown peoples are the ones who are putting themselves most at risk. And so in a place, for example, like Montreal North, in the northern part of the city of Montreal, the second biggest metropolis in the country, there have been just horrific stats coming out of Montreal North. The number of people who have died as a result of COVID-19, who have gotten sick, again, tend to be poorer predominantly Black people. So again,
living in appalling conditions.
Absolutely.
Where social distancing doesn't seem to be practical.
No. So again, that's what the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed in this. Just those are just a few examples of what the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed.
I mean, I'm relatively new to Canada, but one always has this impression of this society being fairly homogeneous, fairly looks after its people. It's a social democratic environment and so on. But suddenly you have an event like this pandemic exposing all kinds of inequalities. Is it because we're just noticing it more, or is this really the underlying structural inequalities of Canada?
Well, again, I think that these inequalities have existed for a very long time. I think that the kind of dominant Canadian narrative, the Canadian myth, essentially is one of denial, or rather, it's one of innocence. Canada has always kind of presented.
You're generous.
It's presented itself. It's presented itself to the world as being, a much more caring, a much more generous society than the one to the nation to our south. Canada has always, compared itself to the United States, and it is like to see itself as being, this gentler, kinder nation. Now, it must be said that there are. There are some positive things that exist in this society, and there have been possibilities for people in terms of social mobility. It is true that there is universal health care in this country, which is significant, and that was something that was fought for. People fought for that to become a reality in this country. And so, it is true that you can get very sick in Canada and not lose your home. Right, you don't have to take out a $200,000 or $300,000 loan in order to pay for the services you received at a hospital. It is true that education, particularly at the post-secondary level, is much more inexpensive. than the education that we see, for example, in the United States. But what I would say is that unlike the United States, I think Canada is a bit less honest in terms of confronting its history, and so we've in recent years many Canadians were surprised somehow at the revelations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which exposed the relationship between the Canadian state and its Indigenous population over the centuries, and what was revealed was quite nasty and brutal and rather disgusting, actually. The kind of experiences that Indigenous peoples have had in this country. That particular commission was looking at the residential school system and the kind of experiences that young Indigenous peoples had to endure in these schools, where they were subjected to all kinds of abuses and racial epithets and mistreatment was quite awful. And so I think Canadians have not really done a very good job of coming to terms with this history, a history which includes a history of slavery. A lot of Canadians aren't aware that slavery existed for some 200 years in this country. It was only abolished in 1834. So again, I think that Canadians are uncomfortable with dealing with these aspects of their history, because in many instances they've chosen either to deny it or they haven't exposed themselves to that history.
Blind deniers, innocent, all different ways of looking at it. But I mean, it strikes me that the example that you've just provided of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, its report, it's structured around a culture of impunity, which successive governments who have been guilty of crimes against humanity, of genocide, in the classic definition that emerged in the post-Second World War period. Yet there is no attempt to prosecute, to hold them to account. Is this part of that innocence?
I think so. I think that coming to terms with the fact that your state, your nation might have been responsible for genocide is a difficult thing, particularly when you've always kind of imagined yourself as being the peacekeeper, right, or being the intervener, right? So Canadians have always, John Humphrey, played a very important role in the Declaration of the International Declaration of Human Rights, which came out, I think, in 1948. John Humphrey was a professor at McGill University, a Canadian hero. Lester Pearson, played a very, very important role as a diplomat and in terms of the working with the United Nations, particularly around the Suez crisis. Canadians have always seen themselves as being honest brokers on the international scene. They've seen themselves as being, concerned about the atrocities that take place elsewhere. So, for example, Romeo Dallaire, another Canadian hero, the general who was in the middle of the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994, and he also is seen as a Canadian hero. He's the kind of prototypical Canadian on the world scene who is trying to do good. So when that's the image that you have created for yourself, and then you're confronted with the fact that on your home territory that atrocities have been committed by you, it's kind of difficult to come to terms with that. It's difficult to grapple with that, and there needs to be a reckoning. When Canadians finally embrace that history and recognize that these contradictions have been part of the country since it emerged in the middle of the 19th century.
I mean, one of the things I've found really striking has been that 10, 15 years ago, when I would come to Canada, speak at a conference or something, if I raise the question of the conditions of the Indigenous people and the frank colonization that this settler population carried out on the people, the genocide, the elimination of peoples, I would be looked at as somebody who's just landed from Mars, who doesn't understand Canada. What I find striking is how much that has changed recently. That there is, in part, it's this acknowledgement that every meeting, we're standing on this territory or that territory. We admit to having stolen your bike, but you're not getting it back, unfortunately. What brought about this change? How is this a really profound change in the Canadian psyche, or is it just another TRC sponsored lip service, but without any serious dealing with the actual issues?
I guess I would say that at some point with these things, there's a kind of I'm going to create a term, but a rhetorical kind of tipping point. So for example, the term Black Lives Matter was anathema in many quarters, not too long ago. And in the last couple of weeks, all of a sudden, everyone has embraced the term. Everyone seems to have embraced the idea, the concept. Apple is talking about Black Lives Matter. The National Football League is talking about Black Lives Matter. I think a similar kind of thing happened a couple of years ago in this country with regard to the Indigenous reality of this country. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was an important moment in this country. The Prime Minister and who's still the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, did acknowledge the terrible history and did apologize on the Canadian, did apologize on behalf of the Canadian state for the genocide that has taken place in this country. So he acknowledged that. And so it became kind of de rigueur. It became, almost a kind of, in order for you to capture, be part of the moment, or in order for you to kind of understand the moment, you had to adopt a certain kind of language in order to demonstrate that you were you recognized this, that you were woke, that it was a kind of a demonstration of one's wokeness, right? That one would acknowledge that we were living on Indigenous territory. And I'm not sure. So although many Canadians have adopted the language, I'm not sure if they have actually embraced the responsibility and they haven't embraced perhaps a certain kind of commitment to redressing and to truly repairing the relationship by even, for example, providing the kind of reparations that would be necessary to kind of at least form the basis of a new kind of relationship with Indigenous peoples. There hasn't really been a real commitment to changing, to affecting the power dynamic in the country that would result in Indigenous peoples, wresting more control over their actual territory. So that would require, a kind of, it would require relinquishing power, and that's it's always power is always very reluctant to share, and is always very, very reluctant to relinquish, and that's essentially what Canadians would have to do if, in fact, they were truly interested in a real reconciliation and a kind of engaging in a much more kind of just relationship with Indigenous peoples.
And to what extent do you think, the Idle No More mobilizations influence that shift, that tipping point?
Yeah, I think Idle No More was an awakening, wasn't it? Like I think that it was, a lot of young Indigenous peoples really came to the fore and demonstrated that they were, unwilling to accept the status quo. And they engaged in actions which I think troubled many Canadians. Many Canadians who regard some of these actions as being overly radical. But I think that for a lot of young Indigenous peoples, this was the equivalent of a kind of it was a Canadian, an Indigenous civil rights movement in this country. And again, I think a lot of Canadians were surprised at the intensity of the protests. They were surprised at the pain that I think that was revealed. They were surprised at the contradictions once again that were that it exposed in the Canadian state.
Right. One looks across the border at the US. The Navajo Nation has the most appalling level of deaths and infection from COVID, and it's a sort of the statistics are extraordinary. They're proportionally larger than in any other population across the United States. How far are there parallels here in Canada?
I've looked a bit at that, and to see what's been happening in the Navajo Nation has been truly horrifying. The lack of the lack of medical care. The fact that the health facilities that exist in other parts of the United States are just not present in that large territory that is the Navajo Nation, and so that's been quite horrifying. Here in this country, we also see the lack of facilities that Indigenous peoples in this country have access to. The fact that they often lack basic infrastructure. We know, for example, that Canada has, I think, more fresh water in its territory than perhaps I think it's any other country in the world, and yet the number of Indigenous communities that lack clean water is really shameful. And so we know, for example, that in terms of just protecting yourself during this COVID-19 pandemic, public health officials talk about the need for people to wash their hands and to maintain. To wash their hands frequently. Well, the truth is that in many Indigenous communities in this country, they can't wash their hands properly because the water isn't safe to drink, let alone to wash their hands. They can't wash their hands with it because it's not, it'll make them ill, right? So that is an indication of the kind of challenges facing our Indigenous communities. We know, for example, that Indigenous peoples, in terms of their social determinants of health, that they are facing major challenges, and in terms of just having access to, proper nutrition, having access to basic foodstuffs, all those things are not present, for many Indigenous communities. So I think there are certainly parallels between, what's going on in the Navajo Nation and what's going on in this country.
I mean, one thing I've been struck by is that across the African continent, it is Canadian mining companies who are the dominant players, who are destroying the environment, who are extracting huge profits and poisoning the water tables and so on. And what has struck me is it's the same companies working in the same territories of the Indigenous people here in Canada. It's quite striking that that's exactly what seems to be going on. But the other blindness I wanted to
And you know what I would say is that, and this is a kind of a criticism of our media, we haven't done enough work to show those parallels, or rather to show that connection. You know, we need to be much more vigilant in exposing the barrack minings, you know, barracks of the world, and the other kind of Canadian mining companies. Talisman is another, not a Canadian mining company. That's a petroleum company. But I'm saying that again, we have tended not to do that kind of deep investigatory work that would be, you know, quite revealing to the Canadian population, revealing about the relationship that Canadian mining companies have in the global south.
Do I sense your new assignment?
Perhaps. You know, I'm a local anchor, so I work in Ottawa, and so it unfortunately I don't get those kinds of foreign assignments. But you know, with you by my side, and if you could serve as my agent, perhaps. You know, perhaps you can make this.
You're on. But let me turn the conversation to the other blindness, or perhaps, to use your more generous term, innocence in Canada, and that's on the issue of racism. And I was struck by the fact that 2 years ago, a book comes out about the police and the racism of the police towards the Black communities in Canada, and I think the whole explosion that has happened following the numerous killings, but what Molly calls the torture and killing of George Floyd, being strangled with a knee for 8 minutes 47 seconds is tantamount to torture, and there's no doubt about that. But that's led to a massive response, not just in the United States, but it's internationally. But here in Canada, it seems to me really striking. Why do you think that is? What lit that touch paper? You know, how do we understand that?
You know, what I'd say, Feroz, is that Black communities in this country have had a very difficult relationship, if we can call it that, with the police for a very, very long time, going back hundreds of years. But let me tell you this story. So I was born in 1970. I was born here in Ottawa. My parents are teachers, but they were also, in the 1970s, they were newspaper columnists. They wrote for the main Black newspaper in this country in the 1970s. It was called Contrast. And so as a child, I spent a lot of time reading that newspaper. It was a newspaper that, you know, Walter Rodney would appear in, and the likes of Horace Campbell and Morris Bishop appeared in that newspaper at various times. So from a very young age, I would read that newspaper. And in the 1970s, you know, there were, you know, some pretty seminal events that took place for African Canadians. So in 1979, there was a gentleman by the name of Albert Johnson, who was a Jamaican immigrant who lived in Toronto. And I can remember reading the story about Albert Johnson, because Albert Johnson was shot by the police in his house. He was killed by the police. And it was kind of like the first major, one would call it, kind of police shooting that had taken place in this country. And it really shook the community. It really shook the Black community. And it shook the wider society as well. You know, Albert Johnson, you know, seems to have been having some mental issues, but there was no reason for him to be shot in the brutal fashion in which he was. The police officers involved were eventually exonerated. And, you know, many people in the Black community regard that still as being, you know, a highly unjust result. You know, they felt that Albert Johnson was murdered, and that the police officers should have been put in jail. When I was growing up in the 1980s and 90s in this country, you know, there were numerous there are these names that I know that are kind of embedded in my, the names kind of left an indelible impression in my brain, because names like Wade Lawson and Anthony Griffin and Marcellus Francois, and again, these were all young Black men who were shot by the police, and so, that police brutality is not something that Canadians, and particularly Black Canadians, are unfamiliar with, and I would say that it's part of, if I can make the point, it's kind of part of slavery's afterlife, because we know that Black peoples in this country have always been surveilled. They've been over policed. They've always been, they've been seen as being threats to the state. They've been seen as being threats to the larger community. And as a result, the state has treated them often, treated us, with abject disdain and brutality. And so this kind of policing goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I don't think it's a surprise, in 1992, when the riots, the uprising took place in Los Angeles, following the acquittal, I guess it was in Simi Valley, of those police officers who had beaten Rodney King to a pulp. Canadians responded. A lot of these stories that happen elsewhere, happen south of the border, for many members of the African diaspora, people, they're seen as local stories, so that Rodney King, was seen as being part of our community, and there was a major response to the riots that happened in 1992 in this country as well, in places particularly like Toronto. So I'm not surprised that Canadians, and particularly Black Canadians, reacted the way they did. To this day, in for example, in a major metropolitan center like Toronto, again, the police have treated Black communities with a lot of brutality. We know, for example, that the stop and searches, or what they call here in Canada carding, the rates of carding that take place in a place, for example, like Toronto, the kind of carding that Black communities are subjected to is really quite astonishing. The incarceration, rates in this country, Black people are, form a disproportionate part of the prison population in this country. So again, I don't think that one should be surprised that Canadians would have the kind of intense response to what took place, to what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, just a few weeks ago. I would have expected, nothing less.
But what has been striking, I think, for many watching what's going on, and it's as much true in the US as it was here in Canada, was that you have this generation of young white people who have joined with energy, creativity, commitment. What is it? What has awakened them? Let me put it another way. Is this a way in which they are seeking their own emancipation by joining those struggles, or is this something else?
Well, that's an interesting question. Maybe we should ask ourselves why we are surprised. Because, to me, anyone watching what took place,
we have a history of that.
No, but I'm going to say this: like anyone watching what happened to George Floyd, right? The fact that this man was kneeled on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he was basically executed in front of our eyes. Anyone who was not affected by that, one would kind of question that person's humanity, right? So I think just on a visceral level. Like, I think a lot of people were just affected at the cavalier nature in which Derek Chauvin, asphyxiated George Floyd in plain sight. I think it was
with his hand in his pocket.
With his hand in his pocket, like just the callousness, the lack of regard, the complete disregard for his humanity. Like it was. I think it was quite. It was very unsettling for all kinds of people, right? So I would just start with that it's one of the kind of more shocking things that I think I've ever witnessed in my life, right? And I'm turning 50 this year, right? So it shook me up to see that. In terms of explaining why so many young white people are responding the way in which they are, I don't know exactly why. Like, I think there's obviously been a shift in the culture. I think that a lot of these young people have grown up with hip hop culture. They've grown up at a time where, and it's different from the 70s and 80s, but they've grown up at a time where a kind of a Beyonce is the kind of Uber entertainer, right? She's the queen. Everyone aspires to be Beyonce. She's kind of like the universal superhero. They've grown up at a time where, I don't know, in this country, basketball has become, the sport of this generation, right? Like there was a time when baseball was the sport, or football was the sport. But I think really basketball has supplanted that. And a lot of young people have grown up with, memories of Michael Jordan, or in this generation, Steph Curry or LeBron James. Like, these are the kind of pop culture heroes of the moment. We can't underestimate the role that hip hop plays in shaping consciousness. It's cool to want to be like Drake, so again, I don't want to simplify matters, but I think all of those things play into the way in which perhaps young white people are relating to Black culture, and relating to, of course, then to Black people. So that's one possible explanation. I don't know if that's the answer, but that's one idea that I have, that perhaps that explains that sense of solidarity, that sense of community. The fact is also that particularly here in Canada, the segregation that existed in this country in the 1950s, 1960s, isn't as stark, so that people are meeting. I guess what I'm saying is people are meeting each other and engaging with each other on a kind of a daily basis, So I don't know, but maybe that's also an explanation as to why we're seeing this outpouring, this reaction.
I mean, do you think this is a moment of radicalization as well? In other words, is this just a transient gut reaction to witnessing the torture and killing, or do you think there are some transitions occurring in people's consciousness? We're talking about a new situation of more radicalized white youth and so on?
Yeah, I guess we'll see. What I can say is, I'll speak to you as someone who works in the Canadian media. So, I've been struck by the number of, well, I'll give you an example. A senior white journalist contacted me the other day, DM'd me on Twitter, expressing her horror with what had taken place, to what had happened to George Floyd in particular, but also just her. It seems as if she's had a kind of an awakening when it comes to the reality of anti-Black racism in this country, of systemic racism in this country, and she sent me a letter saying, expressing her solidarity, asking me what she could do saying that she was committed to making a change and that she wanted to be part of the solution, and asking me for ideas that I might have of things that she could do to intervene to make a difference. So that's significant, and that's laudable, and that provides one with some hope. I've had instances of other people as well, other media people contacting me and kind of trying to engage and asking questions of me that they would not have asked of me, 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. So I'm having different kinds of conversations with white folks in particular. So, perhaps that's a sign, of things to come. Particularly, let's say, within within the media context and with, at a place like CBC, there are changes afoot. And I think that I think something's happened. I think that people have lost, and I'll speak. I think a lot of people of color, I think a lot of Black people have lost their fear of being sanctioned. I think that people are feeling emboldened and feel as if that they can speak in the way in which they've always wanted to speak. So they're saying things that they wouldn't have said, a couple of weeks ago. They are making demands that they would not have made before. They are challenging bosses and challenging, powerful entities in ways that they wouldn't have done before. So, I think something seems to be changing. I've been struck by, people from many different sectors. It's the medical field. It could be the labor field. People are having a lot of conversations about the inequalities that exist, and so, for example, I have family and friends who are involved in the labor movement in this country, and they are telling me that there are, people are challenging even, for example, the labor hierarchy, and wondering why there isn't more, representation. Representation of people of color, representation of Black people in the senior executive. They're having those kinds of conversations. So I think that who knows where this is going to end, but clearly something has shifted.
And there have equally been ongoing struggles of different Indigenous groups, especially in relation to the challenge faced by the mining companies and so on, and indeed the state wanting to build up pipelines and so on. Do you think there is a basis upon which solidarity between the Black communities and the Indigenous communities be something that will grow, or is that going to take a while yet?
No, I think it's already there. I think that those relationships have been built. You'll find, for example, among a lot of young people, they recognize the connection. There was an article, I think an editorial in the Toronto Star just yesterday, in which I think the editorial made the argument that basically suggesting that Black struggles should not supplant Indigenous struggles, and basically saying that Black Lives Matter was taking up too much space, and that there was a danger that Indigenous struggles would not get the kind of attention that they deserved, and there has been an incredible reaction to that, and then you found, you see both Indigenous and Black activists saying, don't try to divide us, that our fates are tied together. And that we are involved in the struggle to kind of change this society together, and don't try to separate us, that our struggles are linked. So I think that is an indication of the consciousness of a lot of these young people, both Indigenous activists and African Canadian activists. This is an indication also of the kind of relationships that they have actually nurtured over time, over years, that these relationships are not new and have been, ongoing for years. I can recall, for example, I went to school in the late 1980s and 1990s. I was, I was a student activist at McGill University. And at that time, with the Black Students Network at McGill, we had forged relationships with Indigenous communities and Indigenous activists at that time. And some of those relationships have endured. And so it's not uncommon for Black and Indigenous peoples, to work together.
I find very refreshing to listen to you, Adrian, because you combine. You're not romantic about some of these problems that are faced in Canada, yet I can hear the bell of hope ringing loud, and I think that's it's a wonderful thing to understand that being hopeful does not mean we are blind, and I hope that will contribute to the removal, the renewal of the loss of innocence of many Canadians, and on which you play a very important part in the media. So I'd really like to thank you, Adrian, for sparing time on a Sunday afternoon to join me here. I just wonder whether you have any message that you would really like to put across to people watching this show from all over the world. What would you like to get across to them?
Well, I think what I'd like to say is that I think for everyone, this has been a very bewildering moment. Bewildering with the COVID-19 pandemic, the horror of the George Floyd killing, murder. So this has been a very unsettling time, bewildering time, terrifying time. We see the effect that Donald Trump's presidency has had on his own country, but also his effect on the world. How it has destabilized things in the kind of global order. So it's a time of worry. It's a time of pain. But I think always it's also a time of and moment of possibility. It's a time where. Oh, I apologize for this phone that's ringing.
All right, don't worry. We all live this kind of life.
My apologies. But what I'll say is that there's. In every moment there's possibility, and I think that there's the kind of opportunity to make change. And I've been feeling, while I too have felt bewildered and unsettled at times in the last number of months, I've also felt exhilarated, and I've also been incredibly energized by what I've seen, for example, at the protests recently, the protests in solidarity with the protests in the United States that happened here in my city, in Ottawa, where thousands of predominantly young people were protesting against anti-Black racism in the middle of Ottawa. Ottawa is it's a pretty it can be quite a sleepy town, quite a conservative place, and yet there were thousands of young people who mobilized in just a couple of days, and it was wonderful. It was just wonderful to see that the strength. It was wonderful to see the resilience. It was wonderful to see the kind of commitment that these young people have to making a different kind of world. And so, sometimes there's a tendency to lose hope in this social media generation, the screen generation. You sometimes hear older folks saying that these young people don't care and they're not committed, and that it's not true. That these are some incredible people who are as committed as any generation has been, and they have all kinds of tools and all kinds of creativity and great imagination, and they're very, very resourceful, and they're going to change things, and so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope, and I hope that it gives other people a sense that things things can change.
Yeah. Reminds me of John Berger's saying, it's not that we should have hope, we should shelter hope.
Indeed.
And I think that's our responsibility. Adrian Harewood, I want to thank you very much for appearing on the show and for this really interesting and insightful conversation. I look forward to seeing you again and at least be together and sup together
I look forward to
when we're together, when we can actually get through this pandemic.
Well, you're
So
a wonderful host. You're a wonderful host, and we have to host you next time, Feroz.
Well,
so thank you.
You know, in Kenya, we'd say, well, it's your turn to take your revenge. Adrian, thank you for joining us. Please, our warmest greetings to your family.
And to yours as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers.
That was the amazing Adrian Harewood talking to me about the COVID and racism and loss of innocence on many areas in Canada. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this Sunday afternoon on Organizing in the Time of COVID. And signing off, Feroz Manji from Daraja Press.